Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
October 1st, 1957, Callie purchased the small cottage overlooking Cimmerian Bluff. She's quite alone in the world. Having just lost both her parents in a head-on collision 3 months ago, she felt it was time to make a life for herself, to move to a new town where no one knew her, a town where she wouldn't be accosted daily by the well-meaning people who offered their sincerest sympathies, despite the fact that they had never bothered to acknowledge that she even existed before the accident. She had no other family. She had no friends. The only things that truly belonged to her were her dog, Hodge, her new job as a page at the town's library, and the broken-down little cottage that she purchased on a whim. Turning the cottage into her personal sanctuary would be a grand task, but the inheritance that she'd acquired would make that possible. From the looks of the exterior, it appeared to be a shell-like ruin, but having gone inside, she realized that with some initiative and a little elbow grease, she could fix it up in no time. A diamond in the rough, she kept telling herself. Once I clean it up and have the water turned on, Hodge and I can move right in. It had been uninhabited since the late 1920s, when a tragedy of heinous natures struck down the elderly woman who lived there with her cat, and it had remained empty until Callie discovered it. According to the citizens of Cimmerian Bluff, a traveling tramp had been blamed for the brutal slaying. The old woman's throat had been viciously torn open in what the police believed to be an act of desperation when the hobo had broken into the woman's cottage and been caught stealing. They never did find the cat. The tramp swore ignorance, claiming to have never been near the cottage, but despite his protests, he was found guilty and hung for his alleged savagery. The townspeople swore that the old cottage was unfit to live in, that it was haunted and did not want to be lived in. But Callie detested superstition as much as she detested unwanted guests. So she bought the house, despite its sordid past, with the hopes that the legend of the tramp and the old woman would deter townspeople from making unwelcomed visits. Callie paid to have the water turned on and the roof and floors repaired, and by the 17th, she and Hodge had taken up residence. True, there was no electricity at this point, but Callie enjoyed the warm glow and snug atmosphere that candlelight and the stone fireplace provided. She enjoyed her first 2 days at work. Shelving books required very little human interaction and allowed Callie to listen to her audiobooks, which always made the time go faster. The only problem she'd experienced thus far was the spotting of a field mouse scurrying into the stacks on her way to the lunchroom. Callie had always loved animals, more so than people, but rodents, they gave her a fright. As a child, her mother had always been cruel to her, insisting that if her room was not spotless, the mice would come into her room at night and bite her toes. Callie's mother maintained that they would scamper into her room every night, searching for a reason to get her. Since then, the very thought of a mouse would cause her to freeze up and panic to wash over her in tidal waves. Thinking of her mother saddened her. She'd spent most of her life trying desperately to win her approval and affections, while her father, on the other hand, had been the most loving person she'd ever known. He was the only person that she enjoyed being around. Now he was gone. She refused to upset herself any further, and cuddled close to Hodge as she sipped a warm cider in front of the fireplace. "This could be a lovely little cottage," she said out loud, talking to both herself and the dog. "We just need some new carpeting, perhaps some floral drapes. Maybe I'll put in some window boxes to really spruce it up around here." Hodge sneezed, bringing her back to the here and now, then plopped his little head back onto her lap. She peered through the cottage windows to see the autumn leaves coming down from the trees that surrounded her new home. Every single one of these villagers must be the town idiot, she chuckled to herself. The house doesn't want to be lived in, she said in a mocking tone. No cottage could ever make her feel more comfortable and at home. No cottage could ever be more welcoming. On October 19th, the first incident occurred. Though she'd taken it lightly and dismissed it at the time, it would be of great significance in relation to later events. Lying in bed that night, somewhere between half-dreaming and half-waking worlds, Callie heard the familiar scratch of claws on the bedroom door. Since he'd been trained as a puppy, Hodge used this as his means of communicating that it was time for her to take him out. The electricity wouldn't be fixed for another 2 weeks, so she found her way to him with the help of the moonlight. Throwing the pudgy Jack Russell over her shoulder, she felt her way down the hallway and made her way carefully to the tiny staircase. A loud snap jolted her upright as the dog leapt from her arms and down to the floor. "It must have been one of those rat traps I set this morning," she whispered to the dog, kneeling down to stroke his soft coat. "A place that's been vacant this long is bound to have vermin. Glad I thought ahead." The thought of a rat in her beloved dwelling made her feel nauseous. What made matters worse is the thought that she would have to go look for the trap and possibly find the disgusting, half-dead little pest squirming to get free. Then what would she do? Worry about that in the morning is what she would do. That vile little interloper would surely be dead by morning, and she'd be able to handle the matter more easily. The following morning, she discovered an enormous rat dead inside the trap. Thank God, she thought to herself. Hodge growled at the grotesque corpse until Callie mustered up enough courage to pick up the trap and throw it out in the garbage bin. It had been the size of a small trout and left her shaking as she ran back into the house to get as far away from it as she could. She set another trap that evening, hoping that they wouldn't hear any more loud snaps in the middle of the night. Living in a house that was supposedly haunted did not bother Callie in the least, but living in a house that was infested with rats was enough to make her skin crawl. Remembering her mother, she wore her shoes to bed that night. Several nights passed, and each morning Callie had discovered dead rats in the traps that had been placed. She phoned an exterminator while she was at the library, but was disappointed to learn that he would be unable to make it to the cottage for another 3 days. No matter, Callie would not allow those disgusting varmints to scare her out of her own house, not when it had become the biggest part of her new life. Around midnight, Callie had heard Hodge's telltale signal scratching at her bedroom door. It was a moonless night, and she had forgotten to bring a candle into the room with her. As she crawled out of bed, feeling her way through the darkness, she could just make out the shape sitting in front of the door. She lifted him onto her shoulder and started carefully toward the stairs. His weight bore down on her heavier than normal. "Whoa, buddy, you're getting heavy. Guess we better cut back on the milk bones, huh?" Callie stroked his coat lovingly. Something was wrong. It felt harsh, coarse, grimy. "Hodge," she managed to mutter through trembling lips. She turned her head to look at him. What she saw glowering back at her sent ice through her veins. Frozen in place, Callie saw 2 beady red eyes and whiskers that unmistakably belonged to a rat. But this rat was larger than any she'd ever seen. It was slightly bigger than Hodge. Where was poor Hodge? As she felt its naked, sinewy tail thumping against her chest and bare arms, she could smell the scent of blood, mingled with the rat's own musty stench. Its whiskers brushed against her cheek, leaving streaks of blood in its wake, as it inched its gnarling snout closer to her neck. What was it going to do to her? It had already eaten Hodge. Why was it perched on her shoulder so calmly, almost calculatedly? Her mother's words popped into her mind. Scampering, she said. They scamper in looking for a reason to bite. But this rat had not scampered. It had waited calmly, as if it were waiting for Callie to figure something out. Suddenly, the pieces of the puzzle started to come together. It had not occurred to her because her own mother had been so disconnected from her. She did not wish to protect Callie from anything. But her mother did not follow the laws of nature. This monstrous rodent that lay heavy upon her, however, did. It's their mother. The voice inside her rang out. She's the mother of the rats I've caught in the traps. Callie didn't know if it was the rat's reaction to the fear that seemed to pulsate from her body, or if it somehow realized that she'd figured out why it was there. But before Callie could find the strength within her to try to fight it, the mother rat sank its grisly, needle-like teeth into her throat. As she fell to the floor, the last thing she saw were those piercing red eyes and the blood-soaked muzzle dripping all over the beautiful new flooring of her beloved cottage. The next morning, the police found her lifeless body at the top of the small staircase. They concluded that a prowler must have attacked her and frightened out into the night. After all, whoever it had been didn't bother to use the door to escape. The downstairs window had been smashed to pieces, and none of the wild animals in the area were big enough to do that kind of damage. They'd tried to warn her before she purchased the cottage. The place was haunted. It did not want to be lived in. The old lady found that out, and sadly, Callie found out too. Oh, but that's just a silly old legend, the real estate agent said with a half-hearted giggle. Something cooked up by the local busybodies because they had nothing better to do back then. I eyed her suspiciously. My husband's job had just transferred him to Cimmerian Bluff, and we were in desperate search of a reasonably priced home where we could start a family. A small cottage set back in the woods, away from the hustle and bustle of town. When we heard the story of Callie and the old woman from his new boss, we'd thought it was a sick joke. The realtor's reaction to our account of the tale calmed my nerves as she invited us to walk into the cottage. It was lovely, cozy, just the type of place that we were looking for. Not to mention, the price was right. We signed the paperwork and were more than ready to move in. But it's funny, as we made our way back to the car, I'm certain that I saw a rat scamper underneath the front door of the cottage.
The kids in my town play like other kids. We look like other kids. And we sound like other kids. However, the children of our town are not like other kids. Other kids, other towns, don't have Neumack Woods. It's heavily rumored that Neumack Woods is haunted ground. Legend states that if a child under the age of 14 travels into the woods after 8 p.m., they'll very distinctly hear a baby crying. I don't know why it's 8 p.m. Maybe because the sun's been long gone by then. I also don't know why the age has to be under 14. But I can take a guess. I'm assuming that it's because kids under that age still have most of their childhood innocence. They say that children are more sensitive to the supernatural than adults, so that's got to have something to do with it. My friend Ricky Doyle lives down the block and over a ways from Neumack, and I'm staying at his house tonight. We've been talking about going out there for months, but just now had gotten the courage to set our plan into motion. We're going to sneak out at 8:15 and go check it out. Ricky and I are both 11 years old since his birthday last week, so that checks out too. We shouldn't have any problem hearing the baby. It was all figured out. A perfect plan. We would eat dinner, pretend to go to bed, sneak out, hear the baby, and be back in bed before anyone knew we were gone. This was our chance to bring some credit to the story. No one we had known had actually gone to the woods. It was always a friend of a friend, or cousin's girlfriend's neighbor who supposedly went and experienced it. Not much went on in our town, and there wasn't much to do. I've always been mischievous, constantly seeking out adventures, and Ricky needs a friend, so it works out for the both of us. His interest in all things creepy and spooky is not as enthusiastic as mine is, and I think he mainly goes along with my plans because he's just happy to have someone to hang out with. School dragged on forever, and finally, it was time to meet Ricky for the buses. My mom wrote a note saying I could ride his bus home with him. By the time I get there, Ricky is already at the bus loop. "Aiden, hey! Did you give your note to the front office to ride home with me?" I take a piece of paper out of my pocket and wave it around like a flag of victory. "Got the bus pass right here," I told him triumphantly. "What's your mom making for dinner?" I asked him. He told me we were having spaghetti, my favorite. We ate quickly that night without a word, not that there was much chance for one. We were shoveling in huge bites super fast, like we had been starved for a week. Ricky's mother smiled at us and she brought out a piece of cheesecake for each of us after we had finished. "You boys want some dessert? Aiden, does your mom let you have cheesecake?" I was about to open my mouth to say, "No thanks," when I caught Ricky's eye across the table. He glanced toward the plates and nodded quickly at me. "Thank you, Mrs. Doyle. I've eaten cheesecake with my mom lots of times. It's really good." Before long, we were saying our goodnights, promising to brush our teeth. We stayed silent in his room after that, just waiting. I felt like I was going to jump out of my skin when it got closer to 8 o'clock. Occasionally, we'd get a glass of water from the kitchen or use the bathroom, which were mostly excuses for us to see what his parents were doing in the living room. We were trying to track their progress towards heading to bed for the night, and finally, we heard their bedroom door close. Both of us had agreed to wait exactly 15 minutes after that to leave the house. With our jacket hoods pulled low over our heads, we dropped out of Ricky's window and entered into the backyard. It was chilly enough outside to where I'm thankful I brought my jacket, but not cold enough to be uncomfortable. Even if it had been really cold, the excitement in my blood would have kept me super duper warm, which is great. "Aiden, do you have both flashlights?" Ricky asked. I shook my head in response. "No, man, I thought you had yours. I just have this one." I held it up and waved the beam around his face. He winced, putting his hands up. "Come on, it's bad enough I don't have a flashlight. Now you want to completely blind me?" I laughed at this and told him we could try to share mine. I didn't want to risk sneaking back in and out of the house again just for one flashlight. I'd just gotten old enough for my mom to let me sleep over at friends' houses that weren't in our neighborhood. We were just getting started with Neumack, and I couldn't mess that up. We entered the woods, then spent a good 15 minutes walking around. We saw a huge black lump off to the right in the middle of the trees. My breath caught in my throat for a second, and I shined the light towards it. It was an old, broken down, and probably abandoned white car. The windows were broken out of it, so it was easy to see into. We walked to it and peered inside, making sure to keep our distance in case someone was living in there. It does happen, you know. "How the heck did this car even get out here? There are trees everywhere." "Maybe it's been here since they were babies," Ricky said. I instantly corrected him, not missing a chance to show off. "They're called, like, saplings or something. There's no such thing as a baby tree." I scoffed at him, but then I thought about everything else that he had said. You know, that is a good question. It doesn't make sense that the car is out here like this. "Hey, when it's daytime, we should come back and check it out for broken glass. If not, it can be ours. We can be the only 11-year-old kids at school to have a car. Or maybe we can make a base out of it, I suggested excitedly. We continued to walk on, agreeing to check on the car again tomorrow. The trail was very difficult. Both of us keep close together to share the beam of light, but that made us bump together a lot. I felt like a pair of Siamese twins in some kind of weird three-legged race. We were bumbling and tripping over any and everything in our paths. It was a blast. We were chuckling and stomping around so hard that I could barely hear any other noises. But something weird got my attention. I shushed Ricky by putting my hand up, pointing to my ear to signal him to stop and listen. There, under the noise of the wind through the trees, I could hear something. I tried to sharpen my ears and block out any other sounds. Yes, that was it. I couldn't believe it. I didn't know whether to feel scared, excited, or worried. Ricky, do you hear it too? The baby. Can you hear the baby? Even in the moonlight, I could tell that Ricky's face had turned a lighter color than normal. His eyes were wide, and he clenched his hands together. Yeah, maybe we should go now, he mumbled to me. I grabbed him by the arm a little more aggressively than I meant to, keeping him in place. Well, I'm going further. If you want to go back, fine. But remember, I have the flashlight. Sorry, I say, smoothing his army jacket out like that would somehow erase the act of me grabbing him. I just want to get a little closer to make sure we aren't imagining it. Oh, come on, please. We've come this far. We can't head back just yet. Against his wishes, he reluctantly followed me through the woods, both of us more scared than we were willing to admit. We seemed to be getting closer to the sound for a while, but then it just stopped. Ricky looked satisfied, like he knew he could start heading home then. He was happy that we got our answer to the stories of Neumack Woods, but for me, it wasn't enough. It didn't really answer anything, it just made more questions. I needed to know where, if anywhere, it was coming from. The cry sounded very real, so I thought that maybe there actually was a baby out there. Maybe they were cold and hungry. Maybe they need help. My mom had a baby a few months ago. She's super annoying, screams and pukes all the time, but I would never want anything bad to happen to her. To any baby, pukey or otherwise. Ricky wasn't having that, though, and he all but dragged me the way we had come. I followed Ricky back to his house, and we snuck back in through the window and tried to go to sleep. His parents were none the wiser. At first, I couldn't stop thinking about the woods and that baby. But after a while, the warmth and fluffiness of Ricky's bottom bunk quilt cuddled me into a deep sleep. Eventually, the lullaby of our snorts and snores drifted out of the cracked window and into the night. The next morning at home, I took advantage of my mom's tiredness, asking her after a long night awake with my sister if I could stay at Ricky's again next Friday. Unless you want us both to stay over here? I wriggled my eyebrow at her. What's one more kid in the house, right? I say. My mom turns to me, giving me an offended smile. Don't you pull that crap on me, Aiden Stewart. I would have said yes if you didn't try to reverse psych me, she joked, kissing me on my forehead as she walked past. I'm glad you two are such good friends, she added, before leaving the room entirely. The school week was long and uneventful. It seemed to drag on and on. You know how things get when you're really looking forward to something. Things become a blur with the end goal in sight. I did all of my homework and went about the motions, mentally counting down the days, then the hours, and then the minutes, until Friday. The day had come. I came to school more prepared than last week. I had extra batteries, 2 flashlights just in case, even some nighttime snacks and Gatorade. It would be just like we were going night hiking, if that's even a thing, which I'm pretty sure it's not. I brought the game that Ricky had wanted to borrow too, and we met up and rode the bus to his house just like last week. We went through the evening, having what they called Mr. Doyle's famous golden chicken breast this time. The excitement had eaten away at my stomach over the day, and I didn't eat as fast as I ate the spaghetti. Mrs. Doyle had bought some mini cupcakes at the store and gave us 2 each. We played some video games to keep ourselves occupied until his parents went into their room. Before long, we were out in the night air again. It was cold tonight, but in a different way. It was the kind of cold that my mom says will settle into your bones, whatever that means. My breath came out in puffs, and my teeth were trying their hardest not to chatter together with chills. I shook it off and pulled my jacket tighter around me, my hood over my head again like some kind of thief or ninja. The vastness of the woods can be confusing, and it's easy to get turned around in there, but I felt less worried when we passed by the weird car. We both had our flashlights, and I breathed a little easier because I knew we were on the right path. I had no idea where we were going, though. I was just walking, hoping to hear the crying. Now, I know it sounds crazy to want to stay, but I had a plan. I had made sure my dad's phone was charged the night before, and I took advantage of my parents' new baby exhaustion. Again. I tiptoed into my parents' room like a ninja this morning to grab my dad's phone, turn it off, and then put it in my backpack without anyone seeing. But it was also that, when we went back in the woods, I could actually record the crying, or any other creepy stuff. This time, we didn't stop at or even mention the car as we passed by it. Our once treasure of a find gave way to a bigger mystery as soon as we got a little further down the trail. I got the phone out and turned on the flashlight feature, my excitement slowly turning into fear. I felt like I could totally puke right then, but I didn't. Ricky would have loved to use that excuse to leave the woods, so I tried to stay at least kind of calm. The thing that had caught our attention just after the car was a hatch, like the kind on those bunkers in war movies. We started to cautiously approach the metal hatch, which was positioned on the ground. We could see the moonlight glint off it from a couple of feet away, and I barely listened as Ricky begged me to walk away. Then, I heard it. A noise startled us, something that sounded like a rock being thrown on concrete, and then the loudest scream I had ever heard in my life came from inside. The volume was so intense and distorted that it almost didn't even sound like a baby anymore. We scrambled back and I dialed the police emergency number on my phone. I told them where we are and what our names and ages are, and when the dispatcher asked what the problem was, I held the phone out towards the metal. I yelled, practically screaming into the phone. "We are alone in Neumack Woods, and there is a baby and this metal door thing. I think it needs help." Common sense told me that an unattended baby underneath a metal hatch would not have survived over the week from when we had last heard it. But it sounded so real. As we were waiting for the cops, a figure came running towards us through the woods. I haven't ever been good at fight or flight. Freeze in place is more my thing. After a moment, we started to run, knowing it couldn't be the police that soon. The figure loomed closer to us, his walking speed nearly matching that of our running speed. When I looked back the second time, Ricky's face disappeared from sight, and a cry cut through the woodlands. My heart dropped, and I realized this time that the screams don't belong to a baby. I ran back to Ricky's house alone, and his mother held me tight as I told her what happened. They called the police, and my parents too, not feeling like they had the option not to. My mom cried hysterically on the other end of the line, and I knew that she'd probably be mad later, especially since she had to get Dad to wake up, then get the baby ready, and then come and pick me up. By the time my parents arrived, the police had just knocked on Ricky's front door, and the officer politely waited for my parents to enter the house before entering it himself. His face looked disturbed, like he had seen something terrible. Please tell me it's not the baby. I couldn't hold back my anxiety any longer. Officer, did you find the baby? Is it going to be okay? I said a few hushed words to the adults, and my mother buried her face in my father's chest. I think she was holding back tears. The officer cleared his throat when he asked me to sit down. He assured me that no babies were hurt or in danger. Then he started to tell our parents what the police found out there in Neumack Woods, inside that metal hatch door. It appeared to be locked from the inside, and they were the first adults to hear the baby cry beside the 911 operator. After some attempts, they managed to pry it open, and then the officer paused. He told me to leave the room, but I heard him now. I heard it all. What they found inside wasn't a baby. It was a very thin, weathered old man holding a tape recorder with the play button pressed. He was bare, except for a pair of dirty, brief-style underwear that appeared to be stained with old blood. His teeth were also reported to have been reddish in nature, and his gray beard was streaked with crimson. The only sign they found of my friend was his blood-covered jacket and his flashlight.
I live in a picturesque little housing development overlooking the Avalon River, just a short drive away from Sombermory. It's surrounded by enough woods to muffle out the sound of traffic on the adjacent highway, and the road leading into the neighborhood is so discreet that delivery drivers regularly have trouble finding it. It always felt safe to me, secluded, an isolated little bubble that the rest of the world seemingly couldn't find even if they wanted to. But that changed in October. It was a gorgeous crisp fall day. The leaves on the giant maples and oaks that surrounded our neighborhood were just starting to change colors, and I had gone out to get my mail from our pair of community mailboxes, the newer ones with the wind-blown maple leaves emblazoned on the side. As I stepped out, however, I noticed that there was a small impromptu gathering of my neighbors on Mr. Kukowski's front lawn, fawning over something that I couldn't quite make out. Whatever the commotion was about, I figured it was probably worth delaying getting my junk mail for a few minutes. So I casually walked over to inspect the spectacle for myself. When my neighbors saw me approaching, they politely moved aside so that I could get a clear view of whatever it was that had them so enamored. It was a jack-o'-lantern man. A snowman made out of jack-o'-lanterns. There were 3 hollowed-out pumpkins stacked on top of each other, and together stood about 5 feet high. The top pumpkin had been carved with a fairly stereotypical jack-o'-lantern face, but the bottom 2 had been carved so that it looked like the figure was dressed in a brocade 19th century suit. "Is that real?" I asked incredulously. While it was obviously completely possible for it to be real, it seemed far more likely that it was some sort of mass-produced plastic Halloween decoration.
Oh, it's absolutely real, Mr. Lacombe.
Lorelei Isley assured me excitedly, her eyes shining like it was Christmas morning. She stuck her finger inside the jack-o'-lantern's mouth, ran it along the inside, and pulled it out to reveal still fresh seeds and pulp.
See?
I stepped closer and tentatively poked the fleshy fruit of each of the 3 pumpkins. They looked real, felt real, and smelled real. and thus I could only conclude that they were, in fact, real. "These are remarkably intricate carvings," I muttered as I ran my hand along the middle pumpkin. I glanced up towards the elderly Mr. Kukowski, who looked like it was taking everything he had not to yell at us to get off his damn lawn. "You didn't make this, did you?"
"What do you think?"
he asked, holding up his clearly arthritic hands.
"No. The damn thing was here when the sun came up. Someone must have dropped it off in the night. Very peculiar. My gut reaction is that it was a prank of some kind. But the thing's too beautiful for that to make any kind of sense."
"And no one else saw anything?" I asked, turning around to face the rest of the neighbors, all of whom shook their heads.
"I'll look over my security footage later, but I don't think it'll have a very clear view of Kukowski's place at night."
Heidi, Laurellan's mom, offered as she used a wet wipe to clean Laurellan's hands.
"I'll send out some emails and put a notice on the bulletin board asking about it, but I'm sure it's just a surprise Halloween decoration."
"If it is, it was poorly thought out. This thing will be a pile of mush by Halloween,"
Kukowski said with a shake of his head, giving the pile of pumpkins a disdainful whack with his cane before turning to go back inside his house.
"You'd better damn well find who's responsible for this before then, because I'm not cleaning it up."
Wait, Mr. Kukowski, I want to get a picture with the jack-o'-lantern man while we're all out here together.
Laurellan pleaded, excitedly waving her phone in the air. Kukowski stopped in his tracks, hung his head, and let out a theatrically reluctant sigh before turning around and joining the rest of us for a group photo. Laurellan posted the picture she took of the jack-o'-lantern man on her Instagram, and I decided to run a reverse image search to see if I could gain any insight about who made it. The results were unexpected. I thought I would get results for a local craftsperson or something, but instead the algorithm matched it with a picture on HeroicHallows.net, a local paranormal discussion forum. The picture was a black and white illustration from an old newspaper article, maybe as far back as the 19th century, depicting a much more monstrous and ferocious-looking jack-o'-lantern man. According to the poster, the jack-o'-lantern men started inexplicably appearing in a nearby, though suspiciously nameless, hamlet on October 1st. There were exactly 30 homes in the hamlet, and each day until Halloween, a new jack-o'-lantern man would arrive in the wee hours of the morning, with no one ever seeing where it had come from. That detail unsettled me a little, since our housing development also had exactly 30 homes. Anyway, all manner of misfortune started to befall the sleepy hamlet, and the increasingly paranoid villagers blamed the orange interlopers. They tried destroying or moving them, of course, but each morning they'd be back like nothing had ever happened. Some of the villagers, children at first, but later some adults, claimed to have seen the jack-o'-lantern men moving around at night, wreaking as much havoc and destruction as they could without getting caught. Naturally, the villagers' hysteria grew stronger the closer it got to Halloween, fearing some sort of inevitable climax on the 31st. Some fled, of course, and some stayed, but ultimately it didn't matter. None of them were ever heard from again. There were no physical remains, no signs of violence or bloodshed. They were just gone. The rest of the forum thread was just increasingly bizarre and baseless speculation about the nature and veracity of the event, and it quickly became silly enough to put my mind at ease regarding any similarity to my current situation. I didn't give it any more thought until I came home from work that night and saw that the jack-o'-lantern man had been lit up. It struck me as odd, given Mr. Kukowski's seeming exasperation with the thing, but maybe one of the neighbors had lit it up instead. The next morning, when the sound of Laurellan's joyful, excited cries came in through my open windows, I tried to deny that they filled me with an ominous sense of dread. I cautiously stepped out my door, and sure enough, there was another jack-o'-lantern man in our neighborhood. It was right next door to Kukowski's house, the Cranner's place, number 2 Willow Wood Crescent. It wasn't identical to the previous one either, clearly made from 3 real, once-living pumpkins with its own distinct design carved into them. I don't suppose anyone saw where this one came from, did they? I asked without much hope as I approached a crowd of onlookers, its size surpassing the one from the day before.
No one. It's pretty damn weird when you think about it,
Jeremiah Craner remarked, more confused and concerned by the jack-o'-lantern man's presence.
This thing's not exactly light, but there are no marks on the lawn from someone dragging it, like it just popped out of the ground where it is.
Oh, do you think they're magic?
Laurelin asked, jumping up and down.
They're mysterious, Laurelin. Let's leave it at that for now.
Jeremiah replied non-committedly, not wanting to crush her exuberance.
I'm going to ask my Aunt Samantha to come look at these. She's a witch, so she'll know if they're magic.
Laurelin proclaimed.
Sweetheart, we've been over this. Your Aunt Samantha is not a real witch.
Laurelin's mother reprimanded her gently.
She was just lonely, got taken in by a New Age cultist, and now works for her as a brainwashed fake psychic.
Laurelin rolled her eyes at her mother's rationalism, but didn't argue with her.
Hey, Kukowski's jack-o'-lantern's been moved.
I heard Tyler Yablokov shout. We all turned to where he was pointing, and sure enough, the jack-o'-lantern man was now right up against Kukowski's front window, peering inside. There were no signs of it being hauled across the lawn, not one blade of grass out of shape, and yet there it was, as though it was as portable as an inflatable Halloween decoration. Laurelin excitedly ran over to the jack-o'-lantern man and began knocking on Mr. Kukowski's window, only to scream when she saw what was inside. Her mother and several others immediately ran over to see what was wrong, and as Heidi comforted her daughter, the others either called for an ambulance or tried to break their way into the house. Kukowski had suffered a massive heart attack and was lying dead on his living room floor when Laurelin found him. The EMTs estimated his time of death as just after sunrise. The prevailing theory among the neighborhood was that the sight of the jack-o'-lantern man at his window had been what triggered the heart attack, and most of us wanted to know who was responsible for it. No one wanted to fess up, and I decided to keep the urban legend I had read about to myself, so no one really had anything to go on. But even without knowing about the legend from Harrowick Hallows, a lot of people suspected that another jack-o'-lantern man would be gracing our neighborhood come October 3rd. Everyone who had anything that could be used as a security camera made sure they were set up and activated, and pointed toward house number 3 if it was possible. We also coordinated a watch around our work and sleep schedules as much as we could, ensuring we had the best chance of catching whoever was responsible for these things in the act. That night, as I kept my vigil on my porch, I saw the lights in both jack-o'-lantern men spring to life, even though I knew nobody would have dared to light them now. Come October 3rd, there was a grand total of 3 jack-o'-lantern men, and the first 2, while still on their original properties, had moved as well. None of our cameras had caught their movement, and by now we were all starting to get seriously unsettled, Craner most of all. If these things were here to pick us off one by one, then it made sense that he'd be next. Tyler was the first one to try to get rid of the damn things and called some of his friends to help him load them up into his pickup truck. I don't remember where he planned on taking them or what he was going to do with them, because it didn't matter. Before he could even get out of the neighborhood, one of his back tires exploded. He lost control and crashed into a street lamp. Nobody died that day, and Tyler himself was fine aside from some whiplash, but that's when most of us became convinced that these things were cursed. Each day a new jack-o'-lantern man would appear at the next house, and the ones who were already present would have changed positions, all without being seen or recorded. They didn't decay as the days ticked by either, always appearing as if they had been freshly carved. Dogs hated them, but they were probably just picking up on their owner's unease. Nobody wanted to try moving them again, not after what happened with Tyler. There were no more heart attacks or car crashes after that, but the threat the jack-o'-lantern men posed still loomed over us all. Each morning, we'd regularly find things broken or missing, the jack-o'-lantern men seemingly to blame. They had a tendency to block off driveways, doorways, and garages, or sit in flower beds or play equipment. It was almost as if they were daring us to move them, but we just worked around them rather than risk it. We didn't talk about them much after the first couple of days, and never within sight or earshot of them. We had come to a general consensus that they were trying to troll us, to egg us into somehow disrespecting them to give them license for revenge. It was around the middle of the month when Llewellyn came knocking at my door. When I answered her, I found her standing next to a woman with long red hair, clad in a long red dress and cloak, with a pentagram necklace and triple moon belt buckle on prominent display. I'm going to go out on the limb here and guess that you're her Aunt Samantha, I presumed.
Yes, that's right. I'm Samantha Summer. I'm a metaphysical counselor and spiritual wellness advisor at Evans Eden of Esoterica in town.
She spoke confidently, as if those were actual valuable credentials. It wasn't hard to see why Llewellyn's mother had described her as a brainwashed fake psychic.
Laura Lynn asked me to stop by and take a look at the jack-o'-lantern entities that have been manifesting in your neighborhood.
Yeah, they've just been popping up one after the other all month. No one wants to just come out and say it's supernatural, but it's pretty damn weird we've never been able to see who's doing this, I admitted, awkwardly rubbing the back of my neck.
Well, I can confirm for you that all of these jack-o'-lantern entities are definitely paranormal,
she said with confidence.
I've been honing my clairvoyance for the past 3 years now, and there's no doubt in my mind that these jack-o'-lanterns are serving as earthly bindings for some manner of non-human spirits. The bindings are strong enough that they can at least manifest some minor misfortunes, and I suspect that at night, and when no one's watching them, they might be able to manipulate the jack-o'-lanterns directly.
I see, I nodded, humoring her at first, but unable to deny the fact that I had no rational explanation for how they were moving or getting fresh candles. Well, do you have any idea why this is happening?
Unfortunately, no. I have found records of at least one similar event over a century ago, but I wasn't able to find any clear cause for that either,
she admitted.
What I do know is that these kinds of spirits demand respect. Don't try to move or damage them, and they'll have no cause to retaliate. You can also buy some goodwill with a token sacrifice, like a coin or a piece of candy. And Samantha and I have already fed Halloween candy to each of the jack-o'-lanterns that are already here, and I'll feed any new ones to try to keep them from hurting anybody else,
Llewellyn said doggedly. She was clearly still shaken by Kukowski's death. Hell, I was too. And it was kind of heartwarming to see how determined she was to keep the rest of us safe. I smiled warmly at her, while her aunt gave her a consoling pat on the back. Is there anything I can do? I asked.
Just avoid disrespecting the jack-o'-lanterns, and when yours appears, be sure to honor it with a small sacrifice of some kind,
Samantha replied.
For good measure, you can make a sacrifice to the rest of them as well. Avoid them at night as much as you can. They're stronger when the veil between the physical and spiritual planes is weaker. It's weaker at night, and it will be the weakest of all on Halloween. I don't know what's going to happen on Halloween, but if you can avoid offending them, I think you should be okay. If you like, I can perform a blessing on your home that should make it a little harder for any malicious spirits to harm you, no charge.
With a reluctant sigh, I let the potentially crazy woman into my house. She did a little ritual and left me with her business card in case I wanted to invest in any of the protective charms they sold as well. They did make me start to wonder if the whole thing might have been some elaborate guerrilla marketing campaign. But I couldn't deny that Samantha did seem sincere in her convictions. I watched through my window as she and Llewellyn went over to the Tyler's house, only to be shooed away like Jehovah's Witnesses. He was still pissed with the jack-o'-lantern men over his truck and neck, and I knew he wasn't going to follow their advice. Somehow that gave me a very uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach. The next day, I and probably everyone else in the neighborhood was woken by the sounds of Tyler's cursing. He had gotten his jack-o'-lantern man, and it had appeared on the roof of his truck. It seems they had finally crossed a line that one of us couldn't abide by, and I watched helplessly as an enraged Tyler climbed up into the back of his pickup truck and furiously shoved the jack-o'-lantern man onto the asphalt below. The pumpkins cracked, but largely remained intact, which Tyler apparently thought was a fate too good for them. He grabbed what I think was a monkey wrench from the toolbox in his truck and just started pulverizing the thing, stomping its hide until it was mush. He was so engrossed in his vengeance that he didn't notice when the parking brake to his truck suddenly gave out, and it started rolling down his inclined driveway. I watched as it swerved, seemingly without cause, and crashed into an electric pole. I'm not a physicist, but there's no way that truck was moving with enough kinetic energy to topple that pole, and yet somehow, that's exactly what happened. I heard it snap like a tree from a bolt of lightning, and saw it fall forward into Tyler's house. Taut power lines snapped, flailed about wildly, and started a fire that would burn Tyler's house to the ground. Even in broad daylight, the smoke and flames from that inferno could be seen for miles. Tyler was devastated, of course, but more than that, he was terrified. A lot of us were terrified. We had no reason to think that burning down Tyler's house would be enough to sate the jack-o'-lantern's need for revenge. For all we knew, Tyler was a dead man, and we might all be next. The day after the house fire, Tyler's jack-o'-lantern man was in one piece again, holding a marshmallow on a stick over the still smoldering rubble. A lot of us decided to leave the neighborhood after that, at least until after Halloween, but not me. I honestly didn't think running away would do any good, and if anything, I'd just be putting innocent bystanders in danger. I stayed, placing spare change into the mouths of each and every jack-o'-lantern man, exactly as Samantha had said. Today, October 30th, the last jack-o'-lantern man appeared, and it appeared on my lawn. I'm at house number 30, you see, right across the street from Kakowski's house, since it's a crescent and all. I slowly pulled back my curtains, knowing it would be there, but dreading the confirmation nonetheless. It was the worst one so far. It was bigger, too. Bigger than I was in both height and girth. Its face was a monstrous, sneering gargoyle, or maybe more like a Japanese oni. Its bottom two pumpkins weren't carved to resemble an outfit, but rather medieval depictions of hell, embellished by the candle glowing inside it. I noticed then that not only it, but all the other jack-o'-lantern men had their candles lit in the daytime, and they were burning brighter than they ever had before. Knowing what I had to do, I steeled up my courage and went outside, a bowl of Halloween candy in hand. I fed my jack-o'-lantern man first, then went door to door to feed the rest of them. Laurelyn's family was among those that left, and I promised her I'd keep making offerings to the jack-o'-lantern men. I fortified my house a little, but what happened to Tyler's place is proof that won't stop them. I can only hope that we've managed to appease them. They're all here now, all 30 of them, and they've got one night left to do whatever it is they're going to do. Tomorrow it won't be children, but the jack-o'-lanterns doing the trick-or-treating. And I can only hope that our treats will be enough to stave off their tricks.
Chapter 1. Kevin's stomach rumbled loudly as he sat staring at the bank of black and white monitors in front of him. "Dude, you hungry?" He slowly turned to his coworker and replied, "Yes, Lucas, I am hungry. What could have possibly given you the clue? Lucas lit up in a smile. Yo, dude, I'm not like a mind reader or nothing. It was that massive growl. When my belly's making noises like that, I'm either like super hungry, or I better be hauling balls to the bathroom because I'm about to... All righty, Kevin interrupted loudly in his best game show host voice. You got it on your first guess. Congratulations, you win a 15-minute break. Right on, Lucas laughed. You're a pretty cool dude, Kev. You're weird as hell, but you're all right. Oh, and hey, I've got some flaming hot Cheetos in my locker that you can have if you want. No thanks, man. I can't eat that stuff. I'm off in a half an hour anyway. Working security on the night shift at Westfield Mall was mind-numbingly boring. Other than having to chase down the random idiot who thought it would be fun to try to spend the night in the mall after it closed, it stayed pretty quiet. He normally didn't mind quiet. He preferred it, actually. Tonight was different. Tonight he was itching to get out of here. He was feeling lightheaded and queasy. He had waited too long to eat, and it was making his mind foggy. He felt angry and aggressive. He saw movement on one of the monitors and glanced over to see Lucas waving his arms over his head in front of Bath & Body Works. He turned his back to the camera, bent over, and pulled his pants down, giving Kevin a full moon. This is the thanks I get for letting you go on break? Kevin mumbled, shaking his head. He looked at his watch. 4:40. 20 more minutes before he could go home. How could it have only been 10 minutes since he last checked? He was really going to have to be better about eating when he was supposed to. When he waited too long, he wasn't as careful about what he ate. And he needed to be careful. When it was finally time to go, he went to the locker room and changed out of his uniform into a pair of jeans and a gray hoodie. He always parked at the very edge of the parking lot next to a wooded area with a jogging trail. He was getting ready to toss his backpack into his old Honda Civic when he was distracted by the smell of food. He shut the hatchback, tucked his hands into his pockets, and walked into the park. His nostrils flared as he got closer to the source. He was buzzing inside, his senses on high alert, looking out for anyone else who might be hanging around in the dark. He was getting closer. The smell was overpowering. It made his mouth water. He looked out into a small clearing, and there she was. He paused and looked around. They were alone. She was balanced on one foot with her other leg bent at the knee against the back of her thigh, the top of her foot in her hand, pulling it into a stretch. She didn't hear him coming until he was right behind her. She quickly turned and gasped, putting her hand on her chest. "Oh my God, you startled me." He smiled and answered, "I'm sorry." "Oh, it's okay. I know you didn't mean to scare me." His smile dropped. "No, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm sorry for what I'm about to do." Her face changed as fear took over, and she turned to run, but he was on her before she could take her first step. He grabbed her from behind, holding her arms down to her sides with one arm and covering her mouth with his other hand, his fingers pinching her nostrils closed as he dragged her into the bushes. She kicked and fought for a few moments, but Kevin was much stronger than he appeared to be, and he easily held her until she lost consciousness. He pulled out his pocket knife, looked down at her, and said, "I really am sorry." Then he sliced her throat open and began to drink. Chapter 2. Fortunately, he only needed to feed every 3 weeks, 4 at the most. He was at 3.5 this time, and he knew better than to wait so long, because when he was starving, he got careless like tonight. Normally, he went outside of his area to hunt, often going where the only people out and about at that time of night were up to no good. But when he smelled her on the way to his car, he lost control. He hated killing. He was overcome with guilt every single time, no matter whose life he took, so he put it off for as long as he could. All he could think about now was the woman's family who would be looking for her and how distraught they would be when they heard she was missing. They would never know what happened to her. Her body would never be found. she would be among the missing who simply stayed gone. He carried a folded duffel bag in his backpack, and once she was drained, he unzipped it, put her inside, hopped in his car, and drove to the crematorium where another vampire named Matteo worked nights. Vampire. He still felt stupid saying it, even after 2 years, but it was true. Kevin was a vampire. It sounded ridiculous. He had been going through a pretty rough patch a couple of years back. He had lost his job and was living in his car scrounging for food wherever he could get it. One night he was dumpster diving behind an Outback steakhouse and was chowing down on half a bloomin' onion and wishing he had some sauce to dip it in when someone grabbed him by the back of his shirt and lifted him out like a dog picking up a puppy. The stranger did exactly what Kevin did to that woman at the park, except he did it while Kevin was awake. He pulled his chin up, sliced his throat, and began drinking. The problem was that he got interrupted while he was draining him when someone came out of the back of the restaurant. So he rolled Kevin under the dumpster and bolted, and Kevin passed out. He woke up on the floor in a basement with the guy that attacked him staring daggers at him from the sofa. "What the?" Kevin mumbled. He was too weak to try to run, and he remembered how strong the guy was and knew it would be useless to try. "Well, this is a mess," the guy said. "Are you going to kill me?" Kevin asked. "Trust me, I want nothing more than to do just that. However, it is forbidden for me to do so. I had hoped that when I came back for you, you would be dead, and I could simply dispose of you. Much to my chagrin, you survived. I am so sorry to disappoint you by not dying under a dumpster after you stabbed me in the neck. I do not accept your apology. You have gone and fouled things up for me terribly," he said. "Now I am responsible for you until you turn someone." "Dude, you stabbed me. How is this my fault? And wait, responsible? Turn? What in the hell are you talking about?" The guy stood and came closer, giving Kevin a much better look at him. He was tall and fit with perfectly tousled blonde hair, striking blue eyes, high cheekbones, and a jawline that could cut glass. "My name is Volodar." "You mean like the guy from Harry Potter where they couldn't say his name?" He sneered. "It's Volodar, you cretin, not Voldemort. I am a vampire. Since I was unable to finish draining you, my saliva got into your bloodstream through the wound I made, and now you're becoming a vampire as well." Kevin was stunned. He had barely begun to process what Volodar said when his ears started ringing and he could feel his heart flopping in his chest. Then it stopped, and he collapsed like a rag doll. The next thing he knew, his muscles began tensing and releasing over and over, his movements completely beyond his control. He looked like he was trying to break dance to death metal. Volodar sat back down and said, "You really shouldn't fight it. It just makes it worse." This went on for what felt like an eternity. Then his entire body did one last big seize that squeezed the air out of his lungs. His eyes rolled back in his head, and the world went black. When he finally started coming around, he lay still for a few moments in the quiet. He felt cold, but not uncomfortable. He had been having back pain from sleeping in his car, and that was gone, and he could hear everything. The ambient noise in the room was magnified. He opened his eyes. Damn it, his vision was still blurry. He reached into his mouth and began feeling around. He heard laughter, and Volodar said, "We don't grow fangs. That's a myth." "Oh, I can hear way better than before. Why can't I see?" Kevin asked. "Your senses will be heightened and you will be stronger. However, the shape of your eyes won't change. You are still visually impaired." "Flawed," he sneered. "But at least it won't get worse." He reached over and handed Kevin his glasses. "So, I look exactly the same?" he said as he put them on. "Yes, and you always will. You can shave that ring of hair on your balding head and that hideous mustache. You can even try to work out to get rid of that potbelly and put some muscle on your scrawny arms. But when you wake from sleeping, You'll be exactly as you were the day before. You mean you looked like a runway model before you were turned? Volador nodded. I did. I am normal, but you will find that you are unique among vampires. Most are chosen carefully because they are flawless human specimens. And then there is you. What is your name? Kevin? Kevin the Undead, Volador said. My God, just when I thought it couldn't get any more embarrassing. Chapter 3. When Kevin finally got home from work, he sat down at his computer, pulled up the Dungeons & Dragons chat room, typed Pambalam, and waited. Within seconds, he saw, Kevin, you're late. I thought maybe you ghosted me. Yeah, I had to stop on the way home to murder someone, he said out loud to himself, but he typed, I'm sorry, had to stop on my way home and grab something to eat. It was not a lie. What did you have to eat? She replied. He hesitated as he tried to figure out how to word it. I'm on a juice cleanse, he typed, so I stopped for something freshly made. How do you do that? I'd be starving. Trust me, he replied, I was. I legit don't think I could ever do a juice cleanse. This girl's gotta eat. Kevin smiled, then typed, You want to Zoom tonight? Is a pig's ass pork? She sent back, and he laughed out loud. Her username in the chat room was Black Betty, and the first time he saw it, he typed in, Whoa, Black Betty. She typed in a laughing emoji and said her name was Pam, so he typed Pambalam. She sent 3 laughing emojis and replied, Exactly. I love that song. He was smitten from that moment. He didn't even know what she looked like, but he didn't care. She made him laugh. She was brilliant, and she liked the oldies. He was done for. She had been asking to Zoom with him, but he had been putting it off. He knew she wanted to take it further and meet him in person. She didn't live very far away, so it would be easy to see her. He wanted to see her. He wanted to spend a lot of time with her, maybe even all of his time. But he didn't know how to do that when he was a monster. The last thing in the world he wanted to do was hurt her or make her think he was some kind of freak. He was a freak. Then a couple of days ago, she sent a message that changed everything. She had gone in for an eye exam to get new glasses, and the doctor saw that one of her pupils wasn't responding to light in a normal way. She went in for an MRI, and they diagnosed an inoperable brain tumor. Pam was going to die, and there was nothing the doctors could do for her. But he could do something. If he turned her, her tumor would stop growing, and she would stop dying. They could be together forever. But what if he turned her and she was upset? What if she just wanted to live the rest of her life as normally as she possibly could, and him turning her into a monster would be devastating to her? He couldn't do it. He needed to find someone else. Volador could wait. His computer dinged and he saw an email from her with a Zoom invitation. He clicked on it, and then it said, Launch meeting. He clicked again. Her window opened, and he was looking at Freddy Krueger. He could hear her muffled laugh, then she pulled off the mask. Her mouth was wide open as she laughed. Her eyes were crinkled up. She had one tooth that was just slightly crooked, and she had a dimple on her right cheek. Her brown curly hair was up in a messy bun, but when she pulled off the mask, some of the curls had escaped and were standing proudly away from her head. She was beautiful. She put on her glasses and saw her hair in the video and said, Oh, good Lord, I didn't really think that one through, as she started to try to tame it. He laughed again and said, No, leave it. I like it like that. She stopped laughing and her face turned red. It's a mess, she said quietly. Yes, it is, he nodded. I love it. They both just looked at each other for a few moments, then Pam's eyes started welling up and she broke the silence. I normally wouldn't be so bold, but seeing as how I don't have as much time as I would like to have, she said as a tear rolled down her cheek, I just want to say that if you don't want to see me anymore, I understand. I know I'm complicated. Complicated? Kevin laughed. Complicated is my middle name. Kevin Complicated Phillips. That's pretty. Thank you. It certainly makes me feel pretty. She smiled and said, You're weird, says the woman who came to this call in a Freddy Krueger mask. Touche. It's okay. I like weird. Yeah, me too. Then he paused for a moment and added, I'm all in. Let's take advantage of whatever time we have. It may be longer than you think. Pam held up both of her hands with her fingers crossed. Chapter 4. Do you ever think about going to Cinnabon to eat the cinnamon roll icing? Dude, I have to fight that urge every day, Lucas said as he dropped another dry Fruit Loop into his mouth and washed it down with a swig of Red Bull. Kevin just shook his head and said, No, Lucas, I can honestly say that I have never thought of doing... Hey, wait, did you see that? Lucas interrupted as he leaned forward to get a better look at the video near the men's bathroom next to Hot Topic. There, right there. I know I saw a shadow or something. Something moved, dude. Yeah, I saw it too. I'll go check it out. No, man, it's all good. I don't mind, Lucas said as he started to get up. No, Kevin yelled a little too forcefully. No, it's okay. I need to get up and stretch my legs. It's probably just a glitch anyway. This equipment has been around since the Dead Sea was just sick. Huh? Take your time. Kevin walked out and got a few steps down the hallway as he counted 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, when he heard, Dude! Followed by a laugh. Not bad, Lucas. You got it in 2 Mississippis, he yelled as he walked away. He knew exactly what was going on with the camera, and he did not need Lucas finding out about it. He got to the bathroom, pushed open the door, and said, How many times have I told you not to bother me at work, he who shall not be named? Voladar stood leaning against the wall. He was dressed all in black with a leather jacket that reached his knees. He had silver rings on every finger and pointy-toed black cowboy boots. Has anyone ever told you that you look like a centerfold for Hot Goth magazine? Kevin asked. Has anyone ever told you that you look like Napoleon Dynamite's brother, Kip? Yeah, actually, I get that a lot. What do you want? I want to know when you're going to turn someone, and I want to know now. You're cramping my style, Kevin. I'm here to give you an ultimatum. You have 1 week to get this done, or I'm choosing someone for you. Got it? I'm working on it, okay? I had someone in mind, but it's just kind of a weird thing to do, you know? It's bad enough to have to kill people so I can live, but turning someone into this for eternity? That's completely different. I don't care how you feel about it. Your feelings mean nothing to me. I need you to get this done because as soon as it is, I have no obligation to you. Do you understand that? You've had months to do this. I'm sick of waiting for you. Okay, I'll figure something out. Kevin stopped and sniffed. Wait, do you smell garlic? Just then, the bathroom stall at the back of the room burst open. The door hit the wall and bounced back hard, hitting something with a meaty thud. A man's voice said, Oh, holy crap! They looked into the stall, and there was a skinny guy with a mullet wearing an outfit oddly similar to Voladar's. He had fallen and was wedged between the toilet and the wall, blood running down his face from the door hitting him in the nose. He scrambled to get up and stepped out of the stall. Get back, you savages! I am Dave, the vampire hunter, he announced with his hand on his nose. Oh, geez Louise, that hurts. I think it may be broken. He pointed at Voladar. I've been following you for days, he yelled and ripped his jacket open, revealing a necklace made out of garlic. Then he unzipped his fanny pack, pulled out a crucifix, and thrust it out in front of him. Nice fanny pack, Kevin said. Or would you call it a crotch pack, since you're wearing it in the front? Hey, Volador, you should get one of those. Then you and Dave could be twinsies. Voladar? Dave said. You mean like the guy from Harry Potter where they couldn't say his name? That's exactly what I said, Kevin replied. Shut up, Volador bellowed. Just stop talking, both of you. Did you really think that you could walk in here with garlic and a crucifix and I would be powerless? What else have you got in that crotch pack? A wooden stake? No, the wooden stake is strapped to my thigh, Dave mumbled. Volador slowly turned his gaze to Kevin. Kill him. Really? Kevin said. Is your solution to every problem murder? Yes. Yes, it is, you twat. That is literally my solution for every problem. I'm a vampire. A monster. That is what monsters do. Ha! I knew it. I knew you were a vampire, Dave yelled as he reached down to grab the stake. Prepare to... Voladar walked over, grabbed him by the shoulders, spun him around, and holding Dave's back close to his chest, he grasped his chin in one hand, the back of his head with the other, and twisted. Dave's neck made a sickening crack and he went limp. He picked him up and laid him across the row of sinks, then reached into his pocket for his knife. Kevin yelled, This is why I don't want to turn anyone. This right here. Do you not see how completely messed up this is? I wish you had just finished the job with me. Do you think I don't regret not finishing you off? I think about it every day. You are my punishment. You are a millstone around my neck. I made an error with you, but if I killed you after you started turning, I would have been put to death. We can't kill each other, or you would have been dead that night. Voladar raged. You have 1 week. 1 week. If I have to come to you, I will come to you with the victim of my choosing, and I will force it upon you. Maybe I should just let you do it. I should just let you choose. I know where your niece lives. Kevin's mouth dropped open. His niece, his sister's only child, Emma. How did you... Voladar smiled. Do I make myself clear? Voladar, please. Do I make myself clear? Crystal. Good. Now get the hell out of my sight so I can finish him while his heart is still beating. Chapter 4. Kevin felt sick. He had disappeared from his sister Katie's life to protect her. He didn't even call or text her in order to keep her and Emma safe. She probably thought he was dead, and he thought that was best. They were the only family he had, and he couldn't let anything happen to her. She had suffered enough with the loss of their parents in a car accident while they were in high school. She didn't deserve what he knew Voladar was willing to put her through. He was more than capable. He would enjoy it. Kevin had no choice. He pulled out his phone and brought up Pam's text thread, typing in, Hey, Pambalam, dinner at my place tonight? He received a response almost immediately. Hey, Kevin Complicated. Dinner sounds swell. I'll pick you up at 8, he texted back. Perfect. What should I bring? Just your beautiful self. She texted her address and a heart emoji. He stared at the heart for a moment, then he sent one back and tucked his phone into his pocket. I really am a monster, he said quietly to himself. Chapter 5. Kevin stood on the porch of the small house trying to work up the courage to knock on the door. He finally raised his hand into a fist and banged 3 times. His knocking was rewarded with the yapping of a small dog. Winky, a woman's voice yelled. Hush, stop. But Winky was on a roll and he was not about to stop now. Hang on. He waited until she opened the door. I'm so sorry, I've never seen him this upset, she said as she opened the door with the dog in her arms still freaking out and struggling to get to Kevin. He was all fur, teeth, and slobber, and he only had one eye. Winky looks like a very angry dust mop, he said. Her face fell, and she blinked hard a couple of times. Kev? Hi, sis. Kevin? Yeah, it's me. She slammed the door in his face and he heard the barking getting further away. Then he heard a door slam inside and the front door opened again without Winky. Katie stood staring for a moment, then she reached out to touch his shoulder. I thought you were dead. I figured. You asshole! She screamed as she started crying and hitting him. He stood there and took it. He deserved it. He deserved worse, actually. She finally stopped and pulled him into a hug, weeping into his shoulder. Then she pulled back and grabbed his upper arms with both hands. Where have you been? What happened to you? A lot, Katie. A lot has happened to me. Too much to tell you right now. No. I need answers. He interrupted. Listen to me. Listen. This is very important, sis. I'm serious. He reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope full of money that he had been saving. What? What is this? She asked, opening the envelope and examining its contents. You need to take Emma and leave for a few days. Leave? What are you talking about? You think you can just show up here after 2 years of me thinking you're dead and tell me what to do with no explanation? Yes, Katie, that is exactly what I expect. You and Emma are in danger, and I can't tell you any more than that right now. You need to go. What have you done, Kev? What have you gotten yourself into? Mom? A small voice said, What's going on? Emma peeked around from behind Katie, and Kevin went to his knees. Emma? She nodded. You've grown so much, he said. You look just like your mama when she was your age. Katie pulled Emma in front of her and said, This is your Uncle Kevin. Uncle Kevin? She said, tilting her head to the side, looking confused. You're supposed to be dead. He burst out laughing. That is the absolute truth, kiddo. He was still kneeling down, and she walked over and hugged him. Mom talks about you all the time. I have a picture of you in my room because she didn't want me to forget you. Kevin hadn't cried in years and could no longer make tears, but he felt the grief of lost time with his family like he had never felt before as he held his niece. I was just telling your mom that she needed to take you on a vacation. Would you like that? A vacation? Oh, Mom, can we? Can we please? Katie nodded her head and said, Yes, sweetie, we can. Why don't you go start packing, okay? Emma turned and ran down the hall. When she was out of earshot, Katie said, Kevin, I'm scared. He nodded his head. Good, you should be scared. There truly are monsters in this world. He was walking back to his car when she called, Kevin. He looked back and she said, If you disappear on me again, I will look for you. I will find you. Settle down, Liam Neeson. My phone number is in the envelope with the cash. Chapter 6. Pam sat across the table from him. He had ordered dinner for her, and now he sat and watched her through candlelight. I feel weird eating this while you watch. Are you sure you can't cheat a little with your juice cleanse and have a bite or two? No, I'm sorry. I honestly can't. You want me to turn around? He said as he spun around and faced the other direction. Oh, that's so much better. That's not awkward at all. She picked up a fork full of lasagna and put it in her mouth. Kevin, this is the best lasagna I've ever tasted. If this is the last thing I ever eat, I can die a happy woman. He was unable to control his reaction as she saw the change on his face. I'm sorry, she said. I know it's weird for me to talk about dying. No, Pam, it's absolutely okay for you to talk about it. You can talk to me about anything. She took a drink of wine and said, You know what sucks? When people don't put their shopping cart in the cart corral when they're finished using them? Well, yes, that does suck, but when people talk on speakerphone while they sit in a restaurant? Yes, that too, but when you're walking down the sidewalk and there's a group of people walking in front of you and they're taking up the entire thing and, Kevin, stop! She laughed. I'm serious. It sucks that I've been alone and healthy for my entire life, and now I've found you and I'm dying. I would give anything to grow old with you. she said as she took another drink of wine. Anything? He whispered. Yes, she slurred. Anything. I think I... Phew. This wine must be really strong. It's going straight to my head. Feel woozy. He walked over to her and said, Come on, I'll help you lie down. I've given you something to make you sleep. It will make the rest of this easier for you. She tried to stand and her knees buckled, but he easily swept her up and carried her to the bed, where he laid her down, kissed her forehead, pulled out his pocket knife, and began the process of turning her into a vampire. It was horrific watching her body go through what he remembered going through, and he was grateful she was unaware of what was happening. After hours of watching the process, she was finally still, and he knew it was done. He heard a knock at the door and he opened it, already knowing who it was. What do you want? Your sister is gone, and I wanted to make sure that you were actually going through with this and not trying to sneak away. It's done, Volodar. He pushed past Kevin and went to the bedroom. He saw Pam on the bed and shook his head in disappointment. She's so ordinary. Kevin pulled back his fist and punched Volodar in the face so hard it knocked him to the floor. It was the first time he'd ever seen him look scared. Get out of my home, and don't ever bother me or my family again, because I swear, Volodar, I will kill you. I don't care what happens to me. I would gladly die for Pam and my sister and Emma. You are a terrible monster, Volodar said, getting up off the floor, rubbing his jaw as he walked out the door. Thank you, he answered. I never want to see you again. Do I make myself clear? Crystal. And Kevin slammed the door. He heard Pam moving in the bedroom, and when he walked in, she was sitting in the middle of the bed looking confused. Kevin, what happened to me? I feel weird. My headache is gone. It's a very long story, Pambalam, he answered. But we have all the time in the world for me to tell you. And he gently helped her put her glasses on.
Ian sat at the red light on the corner of Ripley and Walton. The night was silent, save for the music on the stereo and the sounds of night birds. Streetlights bathed the empty city with sodium radiance. He scanned the rows of tightly packed houses on either side of the street for any sign of life. The stoops and porches were vacant, despite the pleasant springtime weather, and no light shined from any of the windows. While Ian had never been to Ironwood, Minnesota before, he knew its story just the same. He'd seen places like this in his travels, parts of Flint and Detroit, the old town of Thurman in West Virginia, towns that were propped up on a single industry, then buried under its collapse. He didn't know what business Ironwood had been built upon, and it didn't matter. Paper mills, coal mines, or manufacturing plants. Once that staple industry dried up, the story always ended the same. The map on Ian's phone showed that he was still about a mile from St. Teresa's. Maybe the area around the church wasn't so dead. He had driven out of his way to make this show, and he was going to be pissed if no one was there. Then again, the promoter promised him $400 just for showing up. What did it matter to him if he played for an empty room? $400? It seemed too good to be true. Ian rarely made that much money from a single performance, especially since he had gone solo. There wasn't a whole lot of money in punk rock. Most of the time, he made just enough for gas to the next show and a few days of food and beer. In the days following the breakup of Negative Space, Ian had considered trying to reinvent himself. He started writing new songs, more mature and complex tunes, but still with a strong hook. They were good songs, marketable even. All the A&R people who had heard them said as much, but they all agreed that Ian was not marketable. A series of physical deformities meant that he was too ugly to be anything but a punk rocker, or maybe the frontman for a gothy industrial act. His eyes were too far apart and completely black, as if the pupils had ruptured and leaked the ink across the iris and sclera. The tips of his knees and elbows were too pointy and over-prominent. His chin and nose were too angular, his face too gaunt and narrow. A few labels had offered to buy the new songs from him, but he turned them down. The thought of losing ownership of his music made him queasy. He imagined some pseudo-deep corporate rock guitarist playing his melodies and sexpot Disney Channel alumni singing his lyrics. Whatever money a label might pay for his songs, it wasn't enough. The light stayed red and Ian wondered if it was broken. Confident that no cruisers were hiding in the shadows and sick of waiting at an empty intersection, he drove through the light. 2 blocks up, his GPS instructed him to take a left onto Kerrigan Avenue, where the vacant colonials with sagging vinyl siding gave way to long strips of crumbling row houses. Ian slowed down as he approached another intersection, though he intended to treat the red light as a stop sign. Something stirred in his peripheral vision. He held down the brake and glanced over. A twig of a man in ill-fitting clothes watched him from the open doorway of one of the row houses. The details of the man's face were lost beneath the shadows of a hood, but long stick-like arms shot out from the 2 short sleeves of a voluminous sweatshirt. The guy was too tall and thin for his jeans, which were bound around his waist with a piece of rope. Smack or meth, Ian found himself wondering. His money was on meth. The man was fidgety, his movements quick and erratic. An eerie feeling, like that static electricity vibe of being watched, caused the hairs on the back of Ian's neck to stand as he blew the light and continued down Kerrigan Avenue. In his side mirror, he could see the guy watching him. Then again, there wasn't much else to watch out here, so who could blame him? Turning off of Kerrigan Avenue, Ian could now see St. Teresa's off in the distance. It was a plain church by Roman Catholic standards, a whitewashed facade dotted with stained-glass windows that stretched toward the roof. Still, the light gleaming from its open doors seemed almost supernatural next to the miles of darkened windows. The steeple stretched high above the boarded-up shops and condemned restaurants that made up the rest of the defunct downtown area. Ian spotted a few more meth heads as he drove toward the church. One twitched on the ground at the mouth of an alley, the brim of a soiled Minnesota Twins cap covering his face. Another smoked a cigarette while pacing between the husks of wrecked cars in a gravel parking lot. Ian began to worry about his van. The vehicle was his whole life. It's where he lived and slept. It got him from gig to gig. It held all his gear, his merch, and his few meager belongings. The last thing he needed was some tweaker smashing the window or prying off his rims. Ian parked right outside the church and patted his front pocket, feeling for his switchblade. He knew it was there. It always was. But it was a nervous tick of his to double-check on the knife whenever he felt unsafe. He hoped he wouldn't have to use it, but he'd have no issue stabbing some meth head if it came to that. 3 crust punks, 2 dudes and a chick, sat on the steps of the church, passing the joint back and forth. They all wore the same uniform of nonconformity, asymmetrical haircuts interspersed with dreadlocks, black denim vests covered in silk-screened band patches, face piercings, and prison-quality tattoos. Ian watched the group from his van. He studied their faces, and at least 2 of them were moderately attractive beneath the rebel facade and the layers of grime. They went out of their way to make themselves ugly, to make themselves outcasts, but they were just tourists. All it would take for them to rejoin society was a shower and a haircut. They had no idea what it meant to be forced to the fringes of society. The crust punks looked up as Ian stepped out of the van. One of the guys nodded in his direction. The girl arched her back and pushed out her tits. She made an effort not to let her eyes linger on him, playing like she either didn't recognize him or didn't care who he was. It was an annoying bit of theater that always seemed to work on the other band guys.
But Ian had no interest in chicks or sex, and even less interest in head games.
Ian fucking abyss!
The other dude shouted. Ian waved at them as he retrieved his guitar case from the back of the van. He locked the doors and made his way to the stairs of the church. "Thanks for coming out," he said, stopping to shake hands with each of them. The girl, still feigning aloof, offered him a hit from their joint. He took it, inhaled deeply, and held the smoke in his lungs. It had a strange taste, a subtle chemical compliment.
Man, I saw you on your last negative space tour just outside Cleveland,
the most openly excited of the group said.
It was my first punk show. Fucking changed my life.
A twinge of guilt ran up Ian's spine at the words. He looked at the story of hard living etched across the young man's face, the track marks on his arms, the scars from street fights and DIY piercings. He found himself wondering what the lives of these people would be like if they had never heard of him, if he hadn't turned his own misery into a musical pathogen. Would they still be with their mothers and fathers, however imperfect those families might be? Would they be happier with a shitty 9-to-5 and an apartment full of consumerist refuse? Ian shrugged off the train of thought and pushed the smoke out from his lungs. He handed the joint back to the girl, now noticing speckles of emerald in the glowing orange tip.
Is it laced? Maybe.
The girl shrugged.
We got it from the chicken side, the one who put the show together.
Ian nodded and continued up the stairs. St. Teresa's was sparsely decorated, aside from architectural design elements like stained glass windows and cherubs carved into the molding. The pews had been neatly pushed to one side or the other, leaving a huge open space. On the wall above the altar was the ghost of a massive cross, a T-shaped space where the paint was a bit less faded. A girl was fumbling with the wires of a PA system set up in front of the dust-covered altar. She wore sunglasses with massive lenses, and a shock of thick green hair framed a narrow face and angular features. Presumably, this was Tia, the girl who had booked the show. Ian cleared his throat and she turned toward him.
You must be Tia. Fucking A!
She squealed, ignoring his question. Tia rushed toward him, the clomp of her boots echoing throughout the church. Ian offered his hand to her, but she pushed it away and pressed her body against his. Gazing up at his face, she caressed his cheeks. If the girl outside had been trying to play it cool, Tia was the polar opposite.
You look just like your pictures.
Tia ran fingertips along his sharp jawline, up his cheeks and to the bony ridges of his deformed eye socket. No one had ever looked at him with such an expression before. Most people took great effort not to look at him at all.
No, you're not like your pictures,
she corrected herself.
You're even more beautiful.
Tia kissed him, gently biting his lip and giving it a playful tug. Her body felt good against his. He wanted to kiss her back. He wanted to pull her closer. This was something new for him. Sure, he had experimented with a few girls, as well as with a few guys, but he had never enjoyed it. He simply had never been attracted to other people. But this girl, she felt different. Maybe it was her smell or the timbre of her voice. Maybe it was the compliments she had thrown his way.
Whoa,
Ian said, reluctantly pushing her away. Between her makeup and her clothes, he couldn't be sure how young she was, but he knew she was too young.
How old are you exactly? Do you give a shit?
She asked with a tilt of her head.
That's not very punk rock.
She was right. He didn't care how old she was, not really. Neither laws nor rules mattered much to Ian. Tia kissed him again, and this time he let it happen. He returned her affections, grabbing her by the hips and kissing her back. She pushed against him, grinding herself against his growing erection.
Tia!
Ian pushed Tia away and turned toward the voice. A man in the black vestments of a priest stood by an open door toward the back of the church. He wore dark glasses and carried a white cane. Ian scrambled for some excuse for being caught making out with a potentially underage girl until it hit him that the priest was blind.
I'm Ian. Nice to meet you.
The priest began walking toward Ian's voice, waving his cane back and forth to find his way. Ian rushed forward to meet him. He placed one hand on the priest's shoulder and took his hand with the other.
Father Lucas, and the pleasure is all mine.
I'm guessing this is your place. Thanks for letting me play here.
Ian was always exceptionally polite with the people in control of venues. He had learned early on that playing up the I'm punk rock fuck you attitude was not conducive to getting shows.
Thank you for coming. I'm sorry for the state of things. Attendance isn't what it used to be, and the church decommissioned us. So it's kind of a DIY congregation now.
I can appreciate that,
Ian replied. The priest placed his hand on Ian's shoulder and seemed to look him right in the eyes. His expression was earnest for a few moments, and then a smile crept over his face. The strangeness of a blind man holding his gaze creeped Ian out in a way he couldn't fully understand.
You should grab the rest of your gear,
Tia said, taking Ian by the hand and pulling him away from Father Lucas. He nodded in agreement and excused himself. Ian loaded his gear into the church. Aside from the beat-up Gibson SG he'd been touring with for 15 years, there was just a Marshall half-stack, a few pedals, and a box of merchandise. It had been more complicated back in the negative space days when he'd been touring with a full band. Setup was simpler now that it was just him. Tia stood nearby as Ian ran the wires between his amp and pedals. She stared at him with unapologetic admiration. Ian found it almost unnerving. He wasn't used to that manner of attention.
Who else is playing?
He asked, trying to diffuse the awkwardness.
It was supposed to be Surfhurst and the Vengeful and Godless. They both bailed at the last minute. It's hard to get people to play shows in Ironwood. There's not a lot going on here. I'm guessing you didn't offer them the same money you offered me.
Tia smirked and pulled out a chrome cigarette case from her pocket. She retrieved a joint from the case and patted her pocket looking for a lighter. Ian retrieved the Zippo from his jacket and flicked the wheel. Tia smiled and leaned over the flame. Tiny dots of emerald glowed within the orange ember at the tip of the joint. The colors grew more intense as she sucked in the smoke. Ian wondered again what the weed was laced with. Familiar music swelled outside the church, accented by excited howls and loud engines. Tia's smirk faded and she shot an angry glance toward Father Lucas before turning her attention to the open doors.
Sounds like we might have more than 3 people show up,
Ian said.
Seems like...
The words fell flat and lifeless from her lips. Tia sucked on the joint, causing the tip to glow harder, burning orange mottled with kryptonite green. She held the smoke in and pressed her lips against Ian's. He opened his lips, letting her shotgun the smoke into his mouth. She pulled away and headed for the front door. Ian's head swam as he hooked his phone to the mixing board and tuned his guitar. Whatever was in the weed was hitting him hard and fast. The lights on his tuner glared like shifting starbursts. They exploded and wavered every time he hit a string. Finally, he closed his eyes and brought the bridge up to his ear. Plucking 2 strings at a time, he listened for dissonance between notes and adjusted the machine heads until it was resolved. More people filed in as Ian finished setting up. The crust punks from the stairs were followed in by a couple of odd metal guys and a group of high school kids in baseball caps and mall punk shirts. Ian could hear the crust punks making jokes at the expense of the high schoolers. The kids carried on their own conversation, pretending not to hear the jabs. Ian looked up, a slight feeling of vertigo gripping him. Tia was walking back into the church. Several of the local meth heads followed in behind her, their cowed faces covered by greasy hair,
or shrouded by hoods and hats. Their lanky bodies looked even stranger in the light of the church. Their proportions were off, and they walked with jerky movements. Ian shook his head, trying to gain control of his paranoid thoughts. It had to be the drugs he had smoked. They were screwing with his perception and making him nervous. Tia closed the door to the church, and Ian could see her fiddling with something, though he couldn't tell what she was doing. The meth head slumped against the back wall of the church as Tia strode down the center of the chapel.
You ready?
Ian nodded. Tia smiled and turned toward the small crowd. She tapped the mic, eliciting a pop and a wave of feedback.
Hold on to your cocks, motherfuckers! Let's hear it for Ian fucking Abyss!
Ian smirked at the animated introduction as he hit play on the drum track on his phone. The recorded sound of drumsticks clicking together played over the speaker, and Ian broke into a series of manic downstrokes as the drum track kicked in. The song he played was a stripped-down version of Orphan from Negative Space's self-titled debut EP. It was their first hit, as far as you can apply the term hit to an underground punk band. The crowd was already hollering and slamming into each other. They were into it, even without Fungus on bass to fill up the low end and without Luna's manic stage presence behind the kit. Ian was sick of playing Orphan. He had only been 15 when he wrote the song, and he composed much better music since then. Still, he screamed the words into the mic with as much vitriol as he had the first time he sang them. One of the crust punks was inches away from him, screaming the lyrics in unison. Ian wondered if the guy could honestly relate to the song, or if he just thought it sounded cool. Was he the real deal, a gutter punk with no way off the street? Or could he go home to his parents in Connecticut, or L.A., or where the fuck ever when he got bored of playing squatter? Ian's dizziness worsened. The floor seemed to shift beneath him, and the rowdy crowd looked like they were spinning in the narrowing tunnel of his vision. It reminded him of the shifting tubular passageways in a carnival funhouse. He closed his eyes, hoping the disorientation would fade. Ian could feel his knees buckling. He willed himself not to fall and focused on the rhythm of the pre-recorded drums and the feeling of the strings beneath his fingers. Any connection to fucking mankind? I grew up like cold heart, a malignant man. He ran his pick down to low E, then let a diminished D chord ring out. A feeling of nausea welled up in his stomach. He tried to fight it, giving himself to the music, letting his consciousness dissolve into the sound, just as he always did when he was hurting. He screeched the lines of the chorus. And Orphan screaming at the stars, cursing the world for his shitty job. Something hit Ian's guitar, knocking him backward and screwing up the song. He fell on his ass and the guitar let out a squeal of feedback. Ian opened his eyes and tried to keep the church from spinning for long enough to make sense of what had happened. The crust punk who had been singing along with him was seizing on the floor. His two friends stared at him with dazed expressions. It looked to Ian like they were unsteady on their feet, but then again the whole church seemed a bit shaky. The rest of the crowd gathered around Ian and the seasoned crust punk. Some gawked and pulled out their phones to document the scene. Others yelled for someone to call 911. One of the high school kids pushed his way through the crowd, shouting that he knew CPR. As he knelt beside the older punk who had been teasing him earlier, the female crusty collapsed. Her head hit the marble floor with a thud. The last of the trio staggered to his knees to check on the girl. He muttered something about blood, then his body went limp on top of her. Ian looked toward Tia, who stood calmly to the side. The locals and the priest were grouped together behind her. She raised her arm above her head and brought it down in a sweeping arc. The emaciated creatures behind her lunged into the small crowd of Ian's fans. They skittered on all fours, their movements inhuman and their speed incredible. Ian watched in horror as one of the seemingly demonic wretches tackled a high school kid and bit chunks of meat from his neck and face. Another grasped one of the aged metal guys by the waist and burrowed into his stomach with gnashing teeth. A few of Ian's fans managed to avoid their insane attackers and rushed for the exit. The door of the church shook and clattered as they tugged and pushed, but it never gave. Tia strode through the carnage, her stride cool and confident. She took off her sunglasses, and Ian shuddered as she stared at him with bulbous jet-black eyes. Eyes just like his own. An exclamation of fear traveled from his brain to his lips, but it drizzled out of his mouth like a drunken whisper. Tia pressed her bony finger to his lips, hushing him.
Don't worry about those posers, Ian. They'll never understand us.
Tia took another hit from her joint. Ian stared transfixed by emerald specks that glowed at its burning tip. She leaned over and pressed her lips against his and exhaled the smoke into his mouth again. He tried to back away but found himself too weak to crawl or even to keep his eyes open. Ian's head pounded in rhythm with a chorus of croaks. The noise reminded him of crickets or swamp toads, but amplified through movie theater surround sound. A single voice sang an ugly melody beneath the rhythm.
Oh, praise the witch of Ironwood, the daughter of Nob, who lay with flame.
The meter of the singing was awkward. The words fit ill in the space. It reminded Ian of psalms he had been forced to sing at one of the group homes he had lived in as a kid. Bony hands clutched his arms and his boots scraped against the ground as he was dragged along. His eyelids were too heavy to open, and his mouth too dry to form words of protest. The croaking grew louder as he was dragged further along, as did the song of prayer.
All praise the mistress of the end, she who birthed death itself.
Ian moved his tongue around, hoping to coax some moisture into his mouth. A tiny bit of spit formed. His body was beginning to respond to his commands. It was a struggle, but he managed to open his eyes now. He found himself being dragged through a massive basement with rough concrete walls and an earthen floor. The walls were decorated in angular runes and knotwork monsters, rust red sigils and beasts painted upon hard gray backdrops. The locals, the men he mistook for meth heads, were gathered here. All but a few stood still as death, save for pulsating bulges at their throats. Ian shuddered upon seeing them, unshrouded by hats or hoods. Each of them possessed the same deformities as he. Some were more pronounced, some less. Regardless of how exaggerated their unusual features were, each of the men, they all appeared to be males save for Tia, had the same black insectoid eyes and gaunt limbs. Tia stood at the back of the room. Dim light from bare bulbs in the ceiling illuminated her naked form. Her knees and elbows met at sharp points, the bones threatening to break through her skin. The space between her breasts was marked with a series of horizontal ridges. Her waist was waif-thin, a narrow dividing line between her upper and lower segments. Without her sunglasses, Ian could see the bony ridges around her obsidian eyes. He had never known such beauty could exist. Several of Ironwood's emaciated men rubbed her down with dark oil. Father Lucas, who had dispensed with his ruse of blindness, waved a smoking censer around her. The embers inside the censer gave off the same emerald radiance as the laced marijuana had.
Praise the mother of monsters, who loves all of her terrible children,
the priest sang. The two men holding Ian came to a stop. They forced him to his knees and held his arms tight in their grips. He wondered how they were so strong given their slight physiques. Then again, he was stronger than he looked as well. Appearances could be deceiving. The rhythmic croaking stopped all at once. All eyes were on Tia, and hers were on Ian. Her skin glistened beneath the haze of incense, her visage like that of a terrible goddess. She took a step toward Ian, and his heart stuttered.
Dread Engbroda, hear our prayers,
the priest shouted, no longer singing.
Bless our sister Tia, so she may birth 100 young. Place the crown of our race upon her brow.
Let him free,
Tia commanded.
Ian Abyss is not a prisoner. He is our guest. He is our salvation.
The two men released their hold on Ian, and he slumped over without their support. Tia knelt beside him and cupped his face in her hands. She locked his gaze, and he could almost feel the gravity of her black hole eyes sucking him in. A tear streamed down Tia's face.
You're crying. You're just...
she whispered.
You're just so beautiful.
Her words mirrored his own sentiments towards her. Tia was the most incredible creature he had ever laid eyes upon. Ian wiped a tear from her face. Tia kissed him on the lips. She gripped Ian's shirt at the bottom seam and lifted it over his head. She pushed him onto the dirt floor where she unbuckled his belt and pulled his pants down around his thighs. Ian didn't resist as she climbed on top of him and lowered herself onto his erection. The strange congregation formed a circle around Ian and Tia as they made love in the dirt. The priest muttered soft prayers as he watched. Ian was so caught up in the ecstasy of the moment that he was barely unnerved by the cultish audience.
I've waited so long for you. We have waited so long.
Ian watched her, finding such profound beauty in her writhing form that it made even his favorite music seem mundane in comparison. What was the wailing anger of Earth AD, or the dark sovereign spirituality of Sonic Mass, compared to the vision and the touch of the woman atop him? Ian grasped Tina's hips as he approached climax. He held on to her tightly, as if their connection tethered him to existence, as if his whole life had been leading up to this moment. Euphoric chemicals exploded in Ian's brain as he climaxed. He lay on his back, his eyes closed, drowning in a sea of oxytocin. It was the best feeling he had ever known. Better than booze, better than playing music, better than the few times he had shot dope. Tia collapsed on top of him, her breast pushed against his chest, and the bony ridges between dug into his sternum. He moved his hand up from her hips and wrapped his arms around her. This was everything he had been missing his whole life. This was home. A sharp burst of pain shot through Ian's collarbone. He screamed and opened his eyes. Tia's face was pressed into his neck, her head moving back and forth in tight jerking motions. It took him several long seconds to process what was happening. She was biting him, tearing bits of flesh away with her teeth. Ian balled his right hand into a fist and punched Tia in the ribs. She flinched at the blow and a guttural noise bellowed up from her chest. Ian swung again, hitting her in the same spot. This time she pulled her face away from his neck and smiled at him through a crimson veil. Something was happening to Tia's face beneath the wash of blood. Her jaw pulsed as if the bone had split down the middle and was trying to break free from the skin that bound it. Ian moved to punch her again, but Tia gripped his face with both hands and slammed his skull into the dirt, not once, but several times in succession. He looked up at her through the haze of pain and the retreating fog of inebriation. Her eyes were full of love and lust. Tia smiled wider and wider, until the skin in her jaw tore apart and her lower jaw split into two bony mandibles. Blood drizzled from her raggedy, bisected lip, landing on his chest, warm and wet. She rapidly clicked her mandibles together, like the machine gun fire snare drum from one of his songs. The gathered men of Ironwood responded, joining together in a chorus of maddening croaks. Ian thrashed and screamed beneath Tia as Father Lucas shouted out prayers and invocations that were surely not directed to the Christian God or his saints. She parted her mandibles and lunged down on Ian. He struck her in the throat before she could bite into him. She reeled back, gasping. A slimy crimson mist sprayed from her split jawbone as she struggled for air. Ian pressed his advantage, sitting up and shoving Tia off him. Scooting away from her, he drew his legs in tight and retrieved a knife from his pocket. The blade trembled in his hand. Father Lucas knelt beside Tia, stroking her and whispering soothing words. Tia's wheezing slowed, her breath normalizing. The priest's gaze shot up to Ian, and his expression went ice cold.
How dare you? How dare you lay a hand upon her?
Ian clumsily pulled his pants up and got to his feet. He spewed a string of curses as he waved the blade back and forth, hoping to ward off the men surrounding him. None of them had any reaction. They stood still and dispassionate, machines waiting to be turned on. Tia sat up and nudged the priest away. Her tongue darted out, licking blood from one mandible, then the next. It was longer than it had been when they kissed, and thicker, a wet, ropey muscle. Panicked by the sight of Tia's metamorphosis, Ian scanned the area for a means of escape. At the far end of the basement was an unlit passageway, a brick arch framing utter darkness. Ian gave Tia and Father Lucas a wide berth, then ran forward. Tia screeched, and one of the men stepped in front of Ian, blocking his path. Without a second thought, Ian plunged his knife into the man's stomach and shoved him aside. The blade slipped out, red and slick. His heart thundering in his chest, Ian ran for the passageway. He didn't turn around to see if the mad locals pursued him, but he could hear their rapid footfalls behind them. He lunged forward, succumbing to suppressed instincts, and his hands slammed against the earth. Suddenly, he was running on all fours, his pace exponentially faster. The act brought back flashes of forgotten memory. Caregivers and foster parents yelling at him to walk like a human being, and none speculating that he was possessed. A hand grasped Ian's ankle and pulled him back. He kicked with the other foot, the sole of his boot smashing into the face of his pursuer. The hand let go and Ian skittered across the ground and through the brick archway. Ian careened through the darkness, brittle debris breaking beneath his boots and his palms. His foot caught on something unseen, a root growing out from the earthen floor perhaps, or a rock jutting up from the dirt. He stumbled headlong. In a bid to maintain balance, he flailed his arms and grasped blindly. His hand found purchase on something in the dark, and he was able to control his fall to a certain extent. His knees still hit the earth hard, but at least his face was spared. The object Ian caught himself on was roughly half his height. He ran his hand against it, wishing he could see. The thing felt like a cluster of orbs, each smooth and rounded, but the texture was interrupted by jagged lines like cracks in leather. Ian knelt on stinging knees, half expecting the stampede of maniacs to descend upon him while he caught his breath. In that moment, he realized that the terrible sound of their nightmarish locomotion had ceased. The drone of their croaking, or whatever the hell you might call the noise they made, still echoed through the darkness, but they hadn't followed him beyond the brick threshold. In the space between the rhythmic croaks, Ian heard footfalls so soft they might have been in his head. It was Tia. It had to be. Tia, naked and monstrous, stalking him in the darkness. Ian reached up and grasped onto the cluster of orbs. He gripped a rounded surface and tried to pull himself up, but his fingertips ruptured the orb. A watery substance rushed out, followed by a more viscous sludge that reeked of sulfur. An involuntary utterance of disgust shot from Ian's lips as he pulled his hand back and shook the slime from it. He wiped his fingers in the dirt and pushed himself to his feet, not seeking support this time. Ian reached into the pocket of his jacket and grabbed a Zippo. He flicked open the cap and rolled his thumb across the flint wheel. The small flame didn't give much light, but Ian had always had excellent night vision. He never needed much light. The cluster of orbs stood before him, visible in the glow from the lighter. Ian studied the yellow slime that oozed from the ruptured orb, like liquid sunshine, and bile rose in his throat. It was an egg. He was standing before a mound of huge, leathery eggs.
It's okay,
Tia called from beyond the reach of the Zippo's modest radiance.
Those aren't viable. None of them are.
Ian stepped around the clustered eggs and shined his lighter back and forth. The lighter fell upon mound after mound of leathery orbs. He swallowed hard and moved away from Tia's voice, careful not to stumble into any of the clusters.
That's why we need you, Ian. There's something wrong with our bloodline. Maybe there's too much inbreeding. Or maybe it's just the opposite. Perhaps we've tainted ourselves with too much human blood. That's what Father Lucas believes.
Ian picked up his pace, desperate to find an exit before Tia caught up to him and finished what she'd begun. The mounds of eggs became more densely placed the further he moved. Some were already broken. Lines of white and yellow crust dried upon their leathery surface. Others were deflated and desiccated.
Whatever the root of the problem, our males had lost the vitality to fertilize new young.
The light from Ian's Zippo fell upon a waist-high wall of eggs that stretched out into the darkness on either side. There was nowhere else to go. He grimaced, pushing through the mass. Sulphurous yolks soaked into his clothes and bits of leathery husk clung to him. The slimy feeling on his skin was nearly as sickening as the stench of rot and death that hissed out from each ruptured orb. Ian held his arm out, hoping that his flame might fall upon an egress. Instead, he found a monster. There was no other word for it, none that he knew at least.
I think the stress of that, the tragedy of staring at all this unrealized potential, that's what killed our mother.
The creature was perched on a wooden dais that was engraved with interlaced runes and knotwork monsters. It rested on a segmented coil of countless insectoid legs. From that sinuous lower half sprung the body of a woman with gray, brittle skin, the texture of a wasp's nest. Her stomach looked like it had once been distended, but now lay sunken in, and bony ridges shone between her shriveled breasts. Ian stared into the monster's face, framed by long locks of brittle white hair. His lifeless eyes were as black and as wide as his own, but she had so many of them. 4 sets going down her long face. Serrated mandibles sat where her jaw should have been, the same kind of terrible maw that he had seen Tia's mouth morph into. Ian's mind was flooded with a series of unmoored emotions: sadness and homesickness, nostalgia and yearning, love and fear.
I knew there had to be others like us out there.
Ian jumped as Tia's hand grazed his shoulder.
Other hives, hidden among the children of Vesper and Imbla.
This isn't real. Ian shook his head and backed away from Tia. That's some sort of fucked up taxidermy idol.
And what about me, Ian?
He considered Tia with her bisected and serrated jaw, the Zippo flame reflected in her eyes, a wavering flicker of amber against the backdrop of obsidian. She was terrible. She was beautiful. She was inhuman. For this, he had no answer.
We need to finish what we started. I need you inside me, fully and completely, so that I might sit as the new queen. Don't you want to be inside me, Ian?
Tia asked, stroking his cheek. Part of him wanted that. He wanted to be consumed by her in every way. In her eyes and touch, he felt the home he had never found elsewhere. Tia gripped Ian by the hair. She spread her mandibles and pulled him toward her. Oily, viscous fluid ran from her mouth, and Ian found it sexy, the way one might yearn for the glistening mouth of a seductress. The hormonal spell broke as Tia's pincers bit into Ian's face. Ian flinched and squirmed at the pain elicited from Tia's bite. He tried to break away, but her mandibles tore at his cheeks and scraped at the bone beneath. The pain from the lacerations was terrible, but worse was the crushing pressure threatening to cave in his cheekbones. The Zippo fell from Ian's slackened grip. A dull thud echoed through the chamber as the lighter hit the dirt floor. The flame stayed lit and caught the debris on the ground, spreading from the lighter to the husks of the dead dried eggs. Tia's grasp loosened. She backed away from the flame, and Ian fell to the earth among the burning debris. Ancient curses dripped from her tongue, and her mandibles clicked together. She screamed, watching as the fire spread throughout the chamber and licked at the rune-laden days where the dead and terrible queen sat enthroned. Her voice regressed into desperate croaking, and the gangly men of Ironwood poured into the chamber. Father Lucas was the first among them. He scanned the room, awed and appalled. Whispered prayers fell from his lips as he made complex somatic gestures. Tia motioned and clicked, speaking in some language that defied human speech. The men responded to her commands and rushed toward the fire. Some stripped off their jackets and shirts to smother the flames. Others tried to extinguish the fire by throwing themselves upon it. It didn't matter. The blaze spread faster than they could combat it. Ian batted flames from his jeans and hopped to his feet. He ran back the way he'd come, giving Tia and her people as wide a berth as he could manage. None of them even glanced his way. The room on the other side of the archway was empty now, save for the discarded effigy of Christ, who peeked out with one eye from under a yellow tarp. Ian looked back through the passageway at the panicked monsters battling the growing inferno. Nausea set upon him as he tried to make sense of the current surrealness, the inhuman cult and their ghastly burning queen. Fighting to keep his stomach from flipping, Ian stumbled toward the basement stairs but stopped as he noticed the water heater tucked against the wall. His eyes fell upon the black iron gas line that fueled the water heater. His body was already trembling with adrenaline, and it only took a few strong kicks before gas began to hiss from one of the damaged joints. As the smell of gas reached Ian's nose, he ran upstairs and emerged in the church's sacristy. No Christian symbol decorated the room. No Bibles or scholarly religious texts lined the shelves, but rather aged leather tomes with faded angular writing on the spines. Most disturbing were the pictures of him, clippings from magazines and printouts from punk rock websites. These were pinned to a corkboard, and someone had scrawled notes in red ink across each photo. Some of the writing was decipherable, written in Latin script, albeit in a tongue that Ian didn't speak. The normal writing was interspersed with occult nonsense, Nordic runes, astrological symbols, and alchemical formulae. Ian only spent a few seconds staring at the surreal killer-esque shrine to him. He didn't need to understand this place or these people. He just needed to escape. The door of the sacristy opened into the chapel, which was littered with human offal. A few corpses lay eviscerated beside his amplifier, which still hummed with feedback. Others had fallen into bloody heaps by the heavy front door. Ian's fans glared at him with dead eyes wherever they lay. Ian unplugged his SG and let the cable fall into a pool of blood. The amp let out a static hiss as he stumbled away, avoiding the corpses strewn across the floor. Guitar in hand, he ran for the front door. Ian remembered Tia messing with it before commanding her lunatic army to attack. She had locked him in. He rattled the door, desperate to escape before the place blew up or the cultists came clamoring after him, but it wouldn't budge. Cursing and trembling, Ian scanned the chapel for some other exit, and his eyes fell upon the tall stained glass windows that ran the height of the walls on either side. He approached one of the windows. It was a mural of Adam and Eve. At their feet lay what must have been a serpent, but its body was segmented, and it looked more like a millipede than a snake. Another figure lurked in the background of the mural. Delicate channels of lead formed angular tattoos across her glassy ice-white skin. Her eyes were cut from obsidian rather than translucent glass. The figure had to be an angel. That was the only thing that made sense. A grim medieval seraphim holding judgment over Adam and Eve. Even so, that didn't seem quite right to Ian. This woman in the background, even rendered in stained glass, seemed much older, wiser, and far more terrible than any angel dreamed of by man. Ian gripped the neck of his SG with both hands and swung the guitar into the window. Dramatic shards of glass rained down like bits of crumbling rainbow. Lead channels bent and broke beneath the force of the blow. The mural was ruined. The window now looked like a gaping mouth with sharp and wicked teeth. Ian swung the guitar back and forth, clearing away jagged glass and barbs of lead. He tossed the guitar outside, then laid his jacket over the window frame to protect himself from the remaining bits of glass and metal. A loud croaking echoed through the chapel, over the hiss of Ian's amplifier. Father Lucas stumbled out from the sacristy. A revolver hung loose in his grip. His neck bulged in rhythm with the animalistic sound he uttered. Scarlet spittle leaked from his mouth with each croak. The priest raised the gun with an unsteady hand and fired at Ian, but the shot went wide. Ian flung himself out through the shattered window. He landed on his back and the wind was knocked out of him. A string of vulgarities formed in his mind between each gasp as he tried to catch his breath. Ian got up despite the breathless sensation in his chest. He left his jacket and guitar behind and ran from the church as fast as he could. Once again, instinct urged him to lurch forward, and his palm slammed down against the dead lawn. He raced away from the church on all fours, more like a beast than a man. Gunshots echoed into the night. Father Lucas cried out guttural exclamations between each shot. Venom dripped from every harsh syllable. Ian didn't look back. He prayed to whatever gods or spirits might be listening that Father Lucas would keep missing him, and he scrambled for his van. Crouched low, Ian reached up and swung open the passenger side door. A slug grazed Ian's left shoulder as he tried to crawl into the van. He fell against the wheel well, groaning and gritting his teeth. He looked toward the church. Father Lucas stood framed by the jagged remnants of stained glass in the shattered window and drew a bead on him. Ian tried to get up and into the van, but his legs were like jelly. Tears welled up in his eyes, and they shone like polished obsidian. The priest had him dead to rights, but a petite, blazing figure shoved the holy man aside before he could pull the trigger. It was Tia, her aberrant body aflame. She leapt through the broken window and galloped toward Ian on all fours, amber fire trailing behind her, and the ground left burning in her wake. Ian turned and gripped the passenger seat with a shaky hand and pulled himself up. He could hear Tia's hands and feet slapping against the ground. The sound of her sizzling skin pricked the hairs on his arms. He flung himself over the seat and shut the door behind him. Ian shimmied over to the driver's side and slid his key into the ignition. The van roared to life. He shifted into drive and peeled away from the church as fast as he dared. In his side mirror, he could see Tia gaining on him, outpacing his vehicle. The RPM gauge hovered around 2,000, regardless of how hard Ian pressed his foot down on the gas pedal. The van crept up from 30 miles an hour, reluctant to accelerate. Ian swore and punched the steering wheel, eliciting a series of honks. Without warning, a sound like 100 thunderstrikes filled the night. Safety glass splintered and spiderwebbed as the van spun out to the side. Ian gripped the wheel and tried to straighten out, but the vehicle flipped and rolled across the asphalt. Ian would only remember the following moments in blurred mental snapshots. The smell and the sound of gasoline dripping from a ruptured fuel line. The ruins of the blazing church against a lifeless black cityscape. The abrasive pain of crawling through shattered glass. Tia's still and lifeless corpse, burning in the street like a demonic effigy. Ian strummed the opening chord to Orphan for a crowd of 18 fans gathered in a basement in some dying Rust Belt town. The small crowd hollered and cheered. He barked out the first line of the song and they all sang along with him, but he knew none of them really got it. They were fair weather freaks, normal people who could go back to the vanilla world of their parents anytime they chose. He had been sick of playing Orphan for a long time, but it held a renewed meaning for him ever since that night in Ironwood. It conjured images of sad and desperate creatures who looked much like him. It made him think of beautiful women with eyes that gleamed with the blackest hunger. It made him wish he had stayed and given himself to that hunger. Ian scanned each face in the crowd. He looked for familiar deformities, gaunt, elongated limbs or bony ridges around the eyes, but found nothing. That was okay. There was another hive out there somewhere, another forgotten town of monsters like himself. He'd play gigs in every shithole and ghost town across the world if that's what it took. Someday he'd find them, and he would be an orphan no more.
Chilling tales for dark nights.